The house was cold, even for a house that had been abandoned for over 2 years. The walls, stained and cracked, whispered in the silence as the wind howled through the gaps in the windows. It was a house that had long been forgotten, left to decay in the shadows of the forest. But there was something about it, something that felt alive in the stillness, like it was watching, waiting. I hadn't meant to come here. I didn't even know why I'd agreed to help my friend, but when he mentioned a dare, I had no choice but to play along. It was the kind of stupid thing we did when we were younger, exploring haunted places, trying to see who was brave enough to spend a night in a place like this. But this house was different. It wasn't like the others, with their cracked windows and overgrown gardens. There was something inherently wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl as soon as I stepped onto the creaking porch. It had been years since I'd seen Greg, but when he texted me and said he wanted to get the old gang back together, I couldn't resist. We had been close friends in high school, all of us. But time, distance, and the usual drift of adulthood had scattered us to different parts of the country. Still, when Greg reached out, I felt a pull. Maybe I thought it would be like the good old days, maybe I just wanted to escape my own dull routine. But this wasn't the past. This was something else entirely. I looked around the living room as I stepped inside, breathing in the dust-heavy air. The walls were covered with peeling wallpaper that had faded long ago from its once vibrant hues. The furniture was covered in thick layers of dust, as though the house had been frozen in time, a place caught in the middle of some unspoken nightmare. Greg was nowhere to be seen. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I walked deeper into the house, trying to call out to him. "Greg? You in here?" My voice felt muffled, lost in the eerie quiet. The shadows seemed to swallow my words, and the silence only seemed to grow thicker. But I could hear something now, faint at first, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained my ears, listening. I took a step forward, and the floor creaked beneath me, echoing in the emptiness. My eyes darted toward the stairs, but there was no movement. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to move or stay. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps. Closer this time, like someone was coming down the stairs. It wasn't just the sound of someone walking, it was as if the floorboards themselves were groaning under the weight of something heavy. Something that didn't belong. The air in the house grew heavier, thick with tension, and I felt my hands start to shake. Maybe it was my nerves, maybe it was the years of stories about this house finally catching up with me, but I knew I had to find Greg and leave. Fast. I made my way to the staircase, my feet slipping on the dusty steps. The silence was suffocating, and the sound of my breathing felt too loud, too intrusive. I reached the top of the stairs and glanced down the hallway. There were several rooms, all of them dark and closed off. The stairs creaked again, louder this time, but I couldn't see anyone. Greg's voice echoed in my mind. "Don't worry, we'll be fine. It's all for fun." But it didn't feel like fun. Not anymore. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and dim. I moved cautiously, feeling the floor beneath me shift with every step. The air felt colder up here, as though the walls themselves were exhaling something frozen and malevolent. I reached for the door to the first room on the left, pushing it open slowly. It wasn't locked. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a dark, empty room, its contents covered in thick, dusty sheets. The room was almost exactly how I remembered it, untouched, frozen in time, but there was something off. I stepped inside. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner, completely still, staring directly at me. For a moment, I thought it was Greg, but the figure was too still, too unnatural. The shape was too vague to be anyone I recognized. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken on form, twisting and bending into something that barely resembled a human. "Greg?" I whispered, my voice breaking as I took another step forward. The figure didn't move. I couldn't look away. It was like the air had thickened around me, and my feet were stuck in place. The figure seemed to shift slightly, as if it had heard my voice, but it didn't respond. There was no sound, only the suffocating silence that hung heavy in the room. My heart raced, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't. I couldn't take my eyes off it. And then it moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure in the corner shifted, dragging itself out of the shadows. I could hear the sound of something dragging along the floor, something wet, like fabric or skin, or maybe something worse. The shadows around it seemed to stretch, pulling at the walls, the floor, until they swallowed it whole. And then, just as suddenly, the figure was gone. I gasped, stumbling backward, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. There was no way. No way it was real. But the feeling remained. The sense of being watched. Of something lurking just beyond my vision, waiting to make its move. "Greg!" I yelled again, this time my voice louder, more frantic. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't care about the room, or the house, or whatever it was that had been in that corner. I had to get out. I had to find Greg. I reached the staircase and nearly tripped over my own feet as I rushed down. But when I reached the bottom, I stopped dead in my tracks. Greg was standing there, just inside the front door. Except he wasn't moving. He wasn't even blinking. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at him. He was perfectly still, like a mannequin, frozen in place. His face was pale, his eyes wide and staring, but his body was rigid. He looked like he had seen something so terrifying that it had taken him out of reality. "Greg?" I shouted, rushing to him. But there was no response. A cold dread washed over me as I realized that whatever had happened in this house was more than just some stupid dare. It wasn't just a story or a game. There was something in this place, something I had no control over. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it. The low, distant sound of footsteps from upstairs. It wasn't Greg's footsteps. They were heavier, more deliberate. Something was coming down the stairs. The footsteps were growing louder, closer, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from Greg. He was still standing in the same position, his body like a statue, frozen in a way that made my heart race. I could feel the air pressing in around me, heavy with something I couldn't describe, fear, maybe, but more than that. Something deeper, like the house itself was alive, feeding off the terror that had gripped me. I shook Greg by the shoulder. "Greg! Wake up!" But he didn't respond. His skin felt cold, too cold, and I couldn't understand how he could just stand there, not moving, not blinking. I glanced over my shoulder toward the staircase. The footsteps were closer now. I needed to get out. I needed to get out of here right now. I grabbed Greg's arm, trying to pull him toward the door, but his body was rigid, unyielding. It was like he was made of stone. My stomach twisted, and my breath caught in my throat as the footsteps continued, echoing down from the upper floor. They were unmistakably human, but they weren't normal, they had a strange rhythm, almost like something dragging behind them. My heart pounded in my chest as I tugged harder on Greg, but there was no response, no movement. It was as if he couldn't hear me, couldn't feel me. That's when I saw it. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, tall, too tall, and shrouded in shadows. It wasn't human, not fully. The shape was hunched, like someone, or something, was crouching low, waiting, and I could barely make out the outline of its twisted form in the dim light. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace, dragging its feet across the floor, each step leaving behind a wet, unnatural sound. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as my eyes locked onto the figure. It wasn't Greg. It couldn't have been. This thing, whatever it was wrong. "Greg!" I screamed again, my voice shaking, but there was still no answer. The figure at the top of the stairs paused, and then, slowly, it tilted its head to the side. The motion was jerky, like it wasn't quite sure how to move. My blood turned to ice as I watched it, and I had a sickening realization: it was looking at me. The sound of its breathing, ragged, wet, like something struggling to stay alive, echoed in the silence. It seemed to be coming from all around me, filling the house with a noise that made my chest tighten with fear. I needed to move. Now. I yanked harder on Greg's arm, but it was no use. He wasn't budging. The figure began to move again, coming down the stairs with an eerie slowness, its feet dragging along the ground with a sickening squelch. Each step made the floor creak and groan as though the house itself was protesting the weight of this thing, this presence, that was invading its walls. The air in the house was thick with dread, and I could feel my legs weakening, my body screaming for me to run. I couldn't stand there any longer, not with that thing coming closer, not with Greg still trapped in whatever nightmare had taken hold of him. I made a snap decision. I had to leave him. I turned and bolted toward the door, my feet slipping on the dusty floor as I ran. My heart thudded in my chest, and I didn't dare look back. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle. I yanked it open with all the strength I had, the hinges creaking in protest. But the moment the door swung open, I froze. Standing on the other side, framed by the moonlight pouring in from the night, was another figure. This one was smaller, more human-like in shape, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Its face was hidden behind a tattered hood, but its mouth was visible, a gaping, hollow maw that seemed to stretch wider with every second. I stumbled backward, the air knocked out of me by the sheer terror of it. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. This thing, this creature, it was real. And it was standing right in front of me. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, its head tilting in a way that didn't make sense, like it was studying me. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I ran. I shoved past the thing in the doorway, my body slamming into it, but it didn't budge. It didn't even flinch. It just let me go, like it was allowing me to make my move, as though it had all the time in the world. I stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air, my heart racing. The night air hit me like a slap to the face, but it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real anymore. I looked back toward the house. There was no sign of the creature. No sign of Greg. The door slammed shut behind me, leaving me in the cold, dark night. I stood there for a long time, trembling, my mind racing. What was happening? What had happened to Greg? Was this just some twisted game, some elaborate prank? Or had the house, had it done something to him? Something that I couldn't understand. I wanted to leave, to just get in my car and drive far away from here, but the thought of Greg, trapped inside, frozen in that state. I couldn't leave him like that. I couldn't walk away from my friend. But as I turned back toward the house, a strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't just fear now, it was a sense of urgency, like something inside me knew I couldn't wait any longer. Whatever had taken hold of Greg was growing stronger. I couldn't let it take him. But as I stepped forward, I heard a faint noise, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. It was coming from inside the house. "Help me." I froze. It was Greg's voice. It was coming from the house. I had to go back. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. The sound of Greg's voice, pleading faintly for help, was all I could think about as I turned back toward the house. It felt like the walls of the forest around me were closing in, their shadows deepening, urging me not to go back. But I couldn't leave him. Not like this. My hands trembled as I gripped the doorknob and twisted it open. The house greeted me with a deafening silence, as though it had been waiting for my return. The air inside was colder than before, and the oppressive sense of being watched settled over me again. I stepped inside cautiously, the floor creaking under my weight. "Greg!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty space. "Where are you?" I strained to listen, but there was no reply. Just the sound of the wind pushing through the cracks in the walls. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, but it was the same as before, stagnant, decayed, lifeless. Except for the faintest shadow on the staircase. It moved. Not much, just a flicker, but enough to send chills down my spine. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I forced myself forward. I had to know what was happening. I had to find Greg. The stairs groaned as I ascended, each step feeling like it could collapse beneath me at any moment. The shadows at the top of the staircase seemed to thicken, like a veil trying to keep me out. I reached the top and looked down the hallway. "Help me." It was Greg's voice again, softer this time, like it was coming from far away. It pulled me toward the last door on the left, which stood slightly ajar. I reached out to push it open, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, flickering light. There was an old mirror against the far wall, its surface warped and cracked. A faint glow pulsed from it, like it was alive, breathing. Greg was there, standing in front of the mirror. "Greg!" I called out, rushing toward him. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. His reflection in the mirror wasn't mirroring his movements. It stood there, staring back at him, its face twisted into a grotesque smile that didn't belong to Greg at all. My stomach churned, and I stopped in my tracks. "Greg?" I said cautiously. He didn't respond. He was staring into the mirror, his eyes wide and unblinking, his lips moving as if he were speaking, but no sound came out. The reflection tilted its head, its grin widening, and suddenly Greg's body jerked violently. "No!" I shouted, rushing forward to grab him. The moment I touched him, the reflection's face contorted in rage. A sound like nails on a chalkboard filled the room, and the mirror's surface rippled, as if it were water. Greg collapsed into my arms, his body limp, his skin icy cold. "Greg! Wake up!" I shook him, panic taking over. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, I saw recognition in them. "Don't, let it out," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, the mirror began to pulse more violently, the light within it growing brighter. The reflection wasn't Greg anymore, it was something else entirely. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, as though it were trying to pull itself out of the glass. I grabbed Greg under the arms and dragged him toward the door. The mirror let out a deafening scream, and I felt a force pulling at me, trying to drag us back into the room. I fought against it, my muscles straining as I pulled Greg out into the hallway. The moment we crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind us with enough force to rattle the walls. The screaming stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I didn't waste time. I hauled Greg to his feet and half-carried him down the stairs. He was muttering incoherently, his words a jumble of warnings and gibberish, but I didn't stop to listen. I needed to get us out of the house. As we reached the front door, Greg suddenly stopped, planting his feet firmly on the ground. "We can't leave," he said, his voice stronger now but filled with fear. "It'll follow us." "What are you talking about?" I shouted, my patience wearing thin. "We need to go." He shook his head violently. "If we leave, it'll get out. We have to stop it." "Stop what?" "Greg, you're not making any sense." But he wasn't listening to me anymore. He pulled away and stumbled back toward the staircase. "It's tied to the mirror," he said. "If we destroy it, we might be able to trap it." "You can't be serious." I shouted after him, but he was already climbing back up the stairs. I hesitated, torn between running for my life and following him. My instincts told me to leave, to get as far away from this cursed house as possible. But Greg was my friend, and I couldn't abandon him. With a resigned sigh, I turned and followed him. Greg's footsteps echoed through the house as he made his way back to the room with the cursed mirror. I followed, every step filled with a growing sense of dread. The house, with its decaying walls and rotting wood, seemed to hold its breath as if it, too, was waiting for something to happen. I could feel the air shift around me, thickening with a malevolent presence. "Greg, this isn't you," I called out, trying to reach him. His eyes, once filled with fear, now looked distant, lost in a haze that I couldn't understand. "I have to do this," he said, his voice low and hollow. "You don't understand. It's already inside me. If we don't stop it, it will take over." I reached for his arm, but he shook me off. "No. We have to finish this. You don't have a choice." My heart raced as I watched him stagger toward the room. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like someone, or something, was pulling the strings from within. My mind screamed at me to turn around and run, to leave him behind, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. The door to the mirror room creaked open, and I followed Greg inside. The mirror stood as it had before, its surface still rippling with an eerie light. But this time, something was different. The air around it buzzed with energy, like static on the verge of snapping into a thunderstorm. Greg approached the mirror, his hands trembling as he reached out toward it. I tried to stop him, but my voice caught in my throat. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew whatever it wasn't human. "It's too late," Greg murmured, his eyes glazed over. He was no longer looking at the reflection, instead, he was staring into the very surface of the mirror, like it was a portal to something dark and twisted. "It's already here." The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, sharp and frigid. A low, guttural growl rumbled from within the mirror, like something was waking up, something monstrous. My stomach churned as I realized what it was, whatever was trapped inside, it was trying to break free. "Greg!" I shouted, but he didn't respond. His body was rigid, his eyes fixed on the glass. The reflection inside the mirror wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was alive. The thing inside, it, was starting to claw its way out. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stumbled backward. The growl grew louder, and the glass began to crack, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. I watched in horror as the reflection of Greg smiled, a twisted, grotesque grin that wasn't his. "Greg, get away from the mirror." I screamed. But he didn't move. He couldn't. The thing inside had taken hold of him, and it was pulling him in, inch by inch, toward the surface of the mirror. I lunged forward, grabbing Greg by the shoulders, trying to pull him back, but it was like he was glued to the spot. The mirror's surface shimmered and rippled, like it was alive, and I felt something cold and clammy brush against my skin. I turned and saw a long, dark hand reach out from the mirror, its fingers long and jagged, like claws. It brushed Greg's cheek, and I felt the pull of the thing inside, trying to drag him in. "Greg, no!" I yelled, gripping him tighter. But the force was too strong. Suddenly, with a sickening crack, the mirror shattered. The glass exploded outward, showering the room with shards. I felt the sting of a piece slicing across my arm, but I didn't care. My focus was on Greg, whose body had gone slack in my arms. The reflection, the thing, poured out of the mirror like a liquid shadow, curling and writhing, stretching its body out of the broken glass. It was monstrous, too long, too twisted, with limbs that stretched unnaturally and a face that was a blend of human and something far worse, a mask of agony and malice. I stared at it in terror, unable to move, unable to scream. My body was frozen, caught in the grip of some primal fear. The thing opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and it let out a sound, something between a hiss and a roar, that shook the walls around us. Greg's body jerked again, his limbs convulsing as if he were being stretched by invisible strings. His eyes opened wide, glowing with a dark light, and he let out a laugh that wasn't his own. "It's free," the thing whispered in a voice that echoed in the room. "And it's hungry." I shook Greg, trying to bring him back to me, but it was no use. The creature, whatever it was inside him now. His body was no longer his own. The man I had known was gone. The creature that now controlled him turned its head slowly toward me. Its eyes, dark and empty, stared into mine, and I felt a coldness settle deep in my chest. It was taunting me. "Run," it hissed, its voice low and mocking. "Run while you still can." But my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in its gaze. "Greg, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Fight it." For a split second, I saw it, him. The real Greg, trapped inside the monster's eyes. His face flickered behind the dark shadow, his lips moving as though trying to speak. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a breath. I tried to stop it. Then the shadow consumed him again, and he was gone. What stood in front of me was no longer my friend. It was a puppet, a twisted imitation, an empty vessel filled with something dark and ancient. The creature took a step toward me, and the temperature in the room dropped another degree. The air grew thick with pressure, like something heavy was bearing down on me. I had to move. I had to escape. But as I turned to flee, the thing lunged. It was faster than I had expected, its long limbs snaking out to grab me, its claws scraping the floor as it propelled itself forward. I barely managed to dodge its grasp, stumbling backward, but I could feel its breath, cold, rancid, on my neck. It reached out again, its fingers curling around my wrist with an iron grip. I struggled, but the more I fought, the more I felt the pressure of its hold, the weight of its presence pressing into my chest. My vision blurred, and I felt myself sinking into a dark, cold abyss. It was pulling me in, too. And then, just as I thought I was lost, I heard a voice. Not Greg's. A voice from behind me. "Let him go." The voice was strong, commanding, and it cut through the thick air like a knife. The creature paused, its grip loosening for just a moment. And in that moment, I pulled free. I turned, heart racing, and saw her. Standing in the doorway, her eyes glowing with an ethereal light, was a woman. She raised her hand, and the creature screamed. Its form flickered, like it was being pulled back into the very shadows it had emerged from. It clawed at the air, its screams of rage and terror filling the room. But the woman was unrelenting. With a final, deafening cry, the creature vanished, sucked back into the mirror shards scattered on the floor. The room was silent again. I stood there, breathless, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished, my heart still pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on me like the weight of the entire house. My hands were shaking, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. What was that thing? What had it done to Greg? The woman who had appeared in the doorway remained where she stood, her presence commanding and calm, almost otherworldly. She was dressed in an elegant, flowing robe of deep violet, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes, however, were what drew me in. They glowed faintly, an unsettling yet mesmerizing shade of gold, and for a moment, it felt like she could see straight through me, into the very depths of my soul. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice rough with fear and confusion. I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified that she had saved me from whatever nightmare I had just witnessed. She stepped forward, her movements fluid and graceful, like she was walking on air. "My name is Alara," she said softly, her voice low and melodic, but with an undeniable strength behind it. "I've been watching over this house for many years." I opened my mouth to ask more, but my brain seemed to stall. "Watching over it? You know what's happening here?" Her eyes softened, and she nodded. "I know more than you can possibly understand. This house has been a prison for many, and what you've just seen was only the beginning. The creature inside the mirror, it's an ancient being, trapped here for centuries by forces far beyond your comprehension." My mind was racing. I wanted to scream, to run, to demand answers, but all I could do was stare at her, trying to make sense of it all. I thought of Greg, his pale, lifeless body, his eyes wide with fear, and the twisted creature that had taken over him. I could still hear its voice in my head, that deep, mocking tone telling me to run. It was still here, somewhere, lingering in the corners of my mind. "Where's Greg?" I whispered, my throat tightening. Elara's expression darkened for a brief moment, and I saw a flicker of pain in her golden eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "He's gone. The creature consumed him. There's nothing left of the man you knew." A wave of grief hit me then, like a tidal wave crashing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, to tear at the walls of the house until they crumbled beneath me. But I couldn't. There was no time for that now. Not when the real threat was still out there, waiting for its chance to strike again. "What do you mean, consumed him?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You said you were watching over the house. Why didn't you stop it?" Elara closed her eyes for a moment, like she was gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was filled with an ancient sorrow. "This house was built on blood, on betrayal. A long time ago, the previous owners made a deal with something dark, something powerful. They thought they could control it. But they were wrong." I felt a chill run down my spine as the weight of her words settled in. "The mirror, it's a portal, isn't it? A way for the creature to come through?" She nodded, her gaze distant as if she were seeing something I couldn't. "Yes. The mirror was designed as a prison, but the creature's power is stronger than the walls that contain it. Over the years, it has found ways to reach out, to feed on the living. It preys on those who are weak, who are susceptible to its influence." I felt my stomach turn. Greg had been weak. He'd always been the one to get us into these situations, the one who convinced us to explore the haunted places and test the limits of fear. And now, he was gone, lost to something far more dangerous than anything we'd ever imagined. Is it still here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elara's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in them. "Not for long. I've sealed it away, for now. But the house is still cursed. And it will never truly be safe until the source of its power is destroyed." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "And how do we do that? How do we destroy something like that?" Elara took a step closer, her presence commanding but gentle. "The curse lies in the foundation of the house. The betrayal that gave birth to the creature's power still festers beneath it. The only way to destroy the creature is to destroy the source. The mirror is only a symptom. The root of the curse is buried in the earth beneath this house." I glanced around at the walls, the dark corners that seemed to watch me. I could still feel it, something watching, waiting. The air was thick with it, and I had no doubt that whatever Elara was talking about, it was still lurking, just below the surface, ready to return. "You want me to destroy the house?" I asked, disbelief creeping into my voice. "You want me to tear it down?" Elara's gaze hardened. "Not just the house. The foundation, the very ground on which it stands. You must burn the bones of the past. Only then will the creature be truly sealed away." I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around what she was asking. "Burn the bones of the past? What does that even mean?" "You'll understand soon enough," she said softly. "But first, you must leave. You must get far away from here, before the creature can regain its strength. I will stay behind and ensure that it does not escape again." I felt a surge of panic. "But Greg, what about Greg? I can't just leave him here. I can't just forget about him." Elara's eyes softened with sympathy. "I know it's hard. But Greg has already paid the price. The creature has taken him, and nothing you do will bring him back. What you must do now is stop it from claiming any more lives." My heart ached as her words sank in. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. Greg was gone, consumed by the thing in the mirror. There was nothing left to save. I stood in front of the burning house, the flames dancing in the night, consuming everything it had held. Ilara's final words echoed in my mind, "Burn the bones of the past." Greg was gone, but the creature was no more. The house, the source of all this darkness, was reduced to ash. The ground was still, the air lighter. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift. For the first time in a long while, there was silence. The nightmare was over. As the fire died down, I turned and walked away. There was nothing left for me here. It was time to go home.